back. Sorry it took me this long. The month of May has been rather hectic and I've been busy as hell, but we are back and we are going to be looking at the World of Xoth. This is a campaign setting, a sword and sorcery campaign setting to be more precise, created by a guy named Morten Braten back in 2008 with the release of a series of adventures called The Spider God's Bride and Other Tales. This was released for his own Xoth publishing imprint. Previous to this, he had done a book called Ancient Kingdoms Mesopotamia. Hello, cat. That was also very much in the same vein as that we'll see for World of Xoth here. And that one had gotten some very good critical praise. It was released with Necromancer Games for the third edition D&D back in the day. The World of Xoth since then has had multiple adventures, both written originally for 3rd edition D&D, then Pathfinder. Others now more recently been written for 5th edition D&D. They've also been translated to the Mongoose Publishing Legend system that used to be RuneQuest back when they owned the rights. Now that that's moved on, it's their own thing. There have been a couple of one-off adventures written for Barbarians of Lemuria. I think there's an RPG called Blade of the Iron Throne that uses it as a setting. Suffice to say, this thing has got some legs to it. And today, we are going to be looking at the Player's Guide to the World of Xoth. It's more specifically the 5th edition one, the most recent. This one was done in 2021. The original Player's Guide for Pathfinder was in 2015. And as we can see, boobs. We are very much in the sword and sorcery setting right from the get-go. So, as it says, venture in the footsteps of Conan the Cimmerians, Atamprazeros of Uzuldarum, Imaro of Nyumbani, and other fabled thieves, reavers, and slayers. That is exactly the kind of thing we like to look forward to on this channel. So, table of contents, 8 chapters, it's around 70 pages. And of course, credits and disclaimers, and the important disclaimer, word to the wise, this book makes occasional references to mature themes such as human sacrifice, slavery, drugs, racism, and perverted sexuality. Just the kind of thing we love to see on this channel. Such themes, which are staples of the sword and sorcery genre, are simply assumed to be unpleasant but undeniable facts of life in the grim fantasy world described. I know a couple of people would consider grim sexuality and drugs to not be unpleasant at all, but to each their own. The sensible reader should quickly note that these themes are not the focus of the book, they are not explored in depth, nor are they used gratuitously. Remember that this is a work of fiction, and stuff in this book should not be taken as an endorsement of these things in the real world. That said, let's get on with the game. And that is an attitude I wish more games had these days. But the less said about that, the better. So, we've got a nice little map here. First things first, to give you an idea of the location we're talking about here. You have, cold areas up top, jungle down below, deserts kind of in the middle. Standard kind of Howardian sword and sorcery environment. It's very much a Middle Eastern, North African, Mediterranean kind of environment. So good amount of high temperatures and tropical environments with, as you can see here from the arrows pointing off in the distance, more Asiatic regions here in this area and the more Cimmerian cold areas, Vikings and such up this way. So introduction is basically introduction both to the sword and sorcery genre in and of itself and how to adapt the more high fantasy Dungeons and Dragons to that genre. Because let's face it, the kind of default 5th edition D&D is not particularly sword and sorcery. It might count as heroic fantasy, but it's very much on closer to the Tolkien end of the spectrum than it is to the Howard. So first thing you see here, alignment is gone. The only thing you have are basically unaligned and cosmic evil. There's no good alignment to save your bacon if things go wrong, so, be prepared for that. Monsters are, kept to a minimum. You don't want to have hordes of creatures coming at you. Having like one single really, really nasty monster is probably far more in genre than having, armies of orcs and the like. And one thing that helps with that is giving them frightful presence, which is, a way of striking some serious terror into the hearts of even the bravest adventurers. Magic. The sword and sorcery genre is often mistaken for low magic, but that isn't really the case. Magic is all over the place. You run into it pretty much all the time. It's just not treated as a replacement for technology. And when it is, it's in the hands of some seriously unwholesome people. If you look at, for instance, like classic examples like Howard's Red Nails or Zuthal of the Dusk, where they have essentially artificial lighting, but it's radium gems, and you can imagine the long-term radiation effects are not going to be pleasant from that. Also, the people who are using it are a bunch of, horrifying degenerate creeps that, worship demons and such. Not good people. Combat being deadly. You have an expansion on the critical hit rules from the main game. Not only do, in this case, give these options used, do they do extra damage, but you roll the d20 again to confirm, and if you do get further crit, you immediately get reduced to 0 HP. For PCs, that means immediate death saves. For most NPCs and monsters, that's insta-kill. Probably described in the most gratuitously gory way possible. There goes Dougie. Now, this is obviously an option because it makes combat more unpredictable, especially since this is often something the criticism for critical hits than not being used, especially in case of critical fumbles, especially, is because since players roll the dice so much more often than the DM, they're usually on the receiving end of more of this kind of stuff, which is why there's an important thing here for blocking critical hits. If you suffer a critical hit, you can use a reaction to turn into a normal hit by sacrificing a medium shield or a non-light melee weapon. That already increases survivability quite a bit while still creating consequences for being on the receiving end of a particularly nasty hit. Of course, if you want to sacrifice weapon shield to negate the hit, decision must be taken before the second d20 is rolled. So that is important to do. Although in this case, it still reduces the critical back to a regular hit, so it's not a complete waste. There's also the added bonus other thing here of recovering from unconsciousness grants you a level of exhaustion. This kind of prevents the whole whack-a-mole kind of thing that I've seen happen a lot when I was playing 5e, where you'd drop someone to 0, they get healed, and come back fully ready to go, just right back into melee with no consequences. That can get annoying after a while, but this helps mitigate that a bit. Another thing to help mitigate that is the wounds healing more quickly. In a sword and sorcery environment, you're not going to have as much good healing magic, or at least not as much as going to be cast willy-nilly. We'll see that later when we get to the magic section and the class changes. But already 5e does a pretty good job of that with, short rests and long rests that restore all hit points. So at that point, you're not going to be worrying too much about that. You basically should just treat HP as your ability to withstand the damage you take rather than just meat points, and once you start narrowing it that way, you're pretty much good. Also, there's the encouragement to spend treasure as much as you can. I mean, most sword and sorcery characters basically spend everything they have on wine and whores and just, move on to the next adventurer. And, of course, XP bonuses for finding lost cities and such for, encourage a more goal-based thing rather than just, going around killing monsters. There's also the added option of doing the old school 1 XP for every gold piece that's found as treasure, essentially allowing you to money gained from passive or peaceful means such as investments, trades, skilled work, etc. cannot be used to purchase XP. So you want it, you gotta go take it, which is entirely appropriate for certain types of sword and sorcery, especially when you're dealing with more like thieves and raiders and the like. So beyond that, you're also going to be dealing with a more humanocentric setting than the average D&D one. There's no demi-humans, no elves, no dwarves, no frickin' hobbits or anything like that. You might bring in lizard people and the like, but those are going to be mostly relegated to NPCs and bad guys, because let's face it, having ancient empires, fallen empires of reptilian horrors is very much in jar. So one thing that does change here is instead of demi-humans, or in fact normal character backgrounds, you have cultures. Specifically, you have savage, nomadic, civilized, enlightened, decadent, and degenerate. This is basically the life cycle of civilizations when you think about it in certain ways. You have start out with your savages and nomads wandering around the wilderness, they settle down, create civilization, it rises to the peaks of enlightenment, and then falls down the slope of decadence until nothing left but degenerate remnants, and so on and so forth. It's that very much, barbarism, the natural state of mankind, civilization is unnatural as whim, circumstance, and barbarism is always ultimately triumph kind of deal here. So very much in the Howardian mold.
Sorry.
Hello, doggy. We have guests. So, as it says here, for instance, they're inspired by the works of Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, most influential writer of the sword and sorcery literature, frankly, the guy who invented the genre to begin with. So it's very much the cyclical aspect of civilizations. In this case, however, the most important thing is that these ones are how you get your bonuses in spite of the fact that everybody's playing basically humans and there's not much, racial differences between the different players. So for instance, savage characters, which are very much your Conan types. +2 to strength at first level. Sturdy, they have +1 bonus to armor class. Gain advantage on perception skill checks. For those who don't know, advantage is you roll the two d20s and pick the highest result. Simple enough. Superstitious, however, suffer disadvantage on attack rolls against aberrations, fiends, and undead. So demonic horrors, cosmic nastiness, and walking corpses. Well, a little bit of superstitious dread that sneaks in there. Give you an idea of how the savage characters would view themselves, as well as how others would view them, and different ways of getting inspiration from the GM based on how acting in certain ways, such as performing great feats of strength and athletics, defeating dangerous monster or hidden foe in single combat, acting quickly and instinctively instead of overanalyzing, discussing at length, and refusing to use technology, including armor and weapons and other items crafted by civilized cultures, and instead relying on your own strength and prowess. You don't have to do any of these things, but if you want to gain those inspiration points and be able to gain an advantage whenever you want it, these things will come in handy. The same goes for all the other ones. Each one in their own particular way with cultural traits that exemplify their particular place in that cycle of civilizations, as well as the different suggested ethnicities and cultures that this would apply to, along with how common this particular culture would be in theirs. So, for instance, decadents are rather more common among the Gazarites, Lemurans, Taramites, Yar Ammonites. The Namasticians are uncommon here. Azimbans uncommon. That kind of thing. Very rare amongst the Jaka. So, speaking of the different ethnicities of human that you're going to run into, each one of them, in terms of starting abilities, they're all pretty much the same unless stated otherwise. Medium size, base walking speed 30, unless you're a nomad, in which case it's 20, because, they're bow-legged and used to being in the saddle. No common languages. There's no common tongue that, everybody knows by default. Each race has its own language, which very much is in tune for the kind of sword and sorcery environment. You typically have characters that know a lot of, they're well-traveled and know a lot of different languages. And here it very much simulates that. You can gain additional languages gained over the course of play, of course. Starting characters also gain a number of bonus languages equal to their intelligence bonus, or conversely, you reduce that if they're stupid. And they give indications of the kind of things that are most common, like, merchants and sailors speaking a mix of Sushranite and Taramite, which are, good trade languages and probably a good things to pick up if you want to have like a basic tongue that will be useful in many different circumstances. And you have illustrations, of course, for all the different ethnicities in the world of Xoth. You have a lot of Middle Eastern inspired civilizations, as we can see here. These guys here, the Nabasticians, very much kind of like the Macedonian kind of look. Greeks, Sushranites, very Persian looking. So it's very much that kind of environment. Taikangians, more, Asian. Tharak-Thulians, obviously, they're the Northern European types, and Yaramanites, Egyptian looking. So it's very much, you kind of have an idea of what these cultures are like, kind of looking at them, because they are directly inspired by historical cultures, which is very much in line with sword and sorcery. Basically, history is serving as the Cliff's Notes that help you get into in the world that you're entering to, without having to go into too much detail and wasting too much time on exposition. So beyond that, we also have the classes. Here we're starting to see a lot of changes here. For starters, there are no bards, there are no clerics, no paladins. Druids cannot have any shape-shifting abilities. Warlocks are restricted to the Great Old One and Pact of Chain at first and third level, and they need to make sacrifices or services to their patrons as determined by the GM every time they want to level up. So these guys are the most powerful arcane spellcasters in the world of Xoth, but they pay for it in their own way. No sorcerers, at least none in the sense of the D&D class. There are people who call themselves sorcerers, of course. Rangers have also some changes done to them. Basically, the only ones that are largely unchanged: rogues, monks, fighters, barbarians, as one should expect. There are also a couple of new classes to replace the ones that have been completely removed. The Conqueror, which is a bit like the 4E Warlord in a certain sense. It's a fighting class that is more tied to the ability to bolster their allies in battle, set up formations and stuff like that, and exploit weaknesses in the enemies rather than, just fighting on their own. You have different archetypes, of course, for them. Courtier, which is a bit of the replacement for the bard. This is more the social, sneaky kind of, cunning class, which can have, depending on the archetype, a little bit of magic or go straight into seduction and being a complete, temptress and seducing kind of character. Or a spy master if you want to be the sneaky behind the scenes type. And of course, here's one that's going to receive quite a bit of attention, the cultist class, which replaces the cleric. And this one is interesting. Aside from just being the standard, I'd say, spellcasting class for the World of Xoth, you also have some interesting things where your healing spells, all of them, must be powered by sacrifice, either your own blood or the death of another creature. So if you want to actually cast healing spells, you need to start sacrificing stuff, including helpless living creatures as part of the rituals. Or if you want to use the more powerful healing word, mass healing word, can only be cast when you have slain a creature in combat and you triumphantly shout out the word. So there's a vastly different tone for this class than your average cleric. And there's a section also on the different cults that give their different special abilities that are dependent on each one. Also a cool thing, at 10th level, you can draw power from idols that represent the entity worshipped by your cult and do some special things with that. At highest level, you can do some seriously nasty stuff like, let's see, animate object, contact other plane. At 20th level, earthquake, gate, mass heal, meteor swarm, and can animate the idol as a stone golem of equivalent statistics. So that it can be pretty nasty. Of course, the idol in question is pretty hard to move, so it's very much a local kind of thing. Cultist spell list, of course. There's not really any blaster spells, so you're not going to be shooting fireballs at enemies. You're usually going to be hitting as insect plagues or curses or really nasty shit like that. Typically, just shooting lightning bolts and going pew 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 is not going to be in the cards. Druids have special changes to them. Instead of wild shape, they have the ability to draw life force from the land around them, or can use instead of the usual Druid circles, you can pick the spirit world to be more of a witch doctor type. Rangers are more focused towards being explorers. They have no longer any kind of spell casting and are very much more aligned with exploring the natural world, hunting monsters, stuff like that. Or in the case of favorite enemy, you can also pick a particular human culture. So that's very much the thing. One of the ranger archetypes, for instance, is slavers, which are, well, it's a hunter of a different kind, so to speak. You also have a section on new and altered equipment. So different kinds of armor, different kinds of weapons and such. And more interestingly enough, alchemical and herbal items. These are things like strange drugs, weird herbal concoctions, strange alchemical devices and such. Lots of nasty stuff. And now we get to a definite change to regular 5e, the sorceries things. Artillery spells that turn the spellcaster into a walking piece of artillery, able to wipe out a small army of opponents with a single spell. Fireball and all its derivatives. Lightning bolt, cone of cold, gone. All excluded. Convenience spells, stuff like rope trick, creating food and water, also gone. Healing spells, life force restored to a creature restored to a creature via healing spells, must be transferred or taken from somewhere else. So that's the reason why only cultists have access to healing spells and only via sacrifice. You want to heal somebody, you got to take it from something else, including maybe yourself if you're not in a bit of a pinch. Or if you don't feel like killing something. What kind of a decision is that? Teleportation? No. There's simply, none of that. Death is final. There ain't no resurrection. If you get brought back to life, probably you're going to wish you were dead. Powerful low-level divinations. Detect magic. Any kind of comprehend languages, stuff like that. No. Anything that makes a sorcerer's life too easy, it's just not exactly anything that has to do with that kind of thing. You want sorcery to be very much something of last resort, so to speak. You want to be able to look at this spellcaster in your party and saying, do I really want you to start casting spells right now? Not sure. Also, any kind of superhero spells, flying through the air, turning invisible, and that kind of stuff. Those two are particularly powerful in worlds where most people do not have any kind of countermeasures against that kind of stuff, and they're therefore restricted. The same goes for magic items. So for instance, in a regular 5e, you would have like a gem of brightness, which is the example I use here. Those are, you can find those all over the place. In this case, it would be called the Jewel of Lar Karashtat, and probably be the only gem of its kind in the entire campaign world. So your basic magic items in any other campaign would here be artifacts. And there might be quite a few of them lying around, but they're definitely not the kind of thing you're going to see replicated or even sold in shops or anything like that. Summoning spells are also altered. And instead of a protection from evil, you have protection from witchcraft, also called known as the Sign of Xoth, which is not much of a change, but it is a bit of setting-specific information. Since there's no alignment to good and evil, it's basically a protection against magic. At GM's discretion, the Sign of Xoth can sometimes be known and used even by non-spellcasters as a ritual to protect their homes against the terrors of the night, in which case it works as a magic circle, including associated material cost. So that's a nice little idea, having a little bit of folk magic that can actually have some effect. And then you have some new spells. A lot of these are curses, weird kind of strange effects. Incantation of the Broken Limb. Causes damage, 3d10 points of necrotic damage, and suffers from an arm or leg injury. If an arm injury, basically just causing people's legs to break just by doing that. Choose a living creature with internal skeleton limbs, yeah. Also, you have, let's see, Curse of Green Decay. Loathsome spell slowly turns the victim's body into a quivering mass of green slime. That's just 4th level. That is not particularly hard to cast. Black Fist of Ptathana. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that. Slow to telekinesis thing that rips a person's heart out of their chest. Interesting stuff. There's also like little weird things like Fertility Charm, which is not completely non-combat use, but basically makes it much more useful for people who want to get laid and actually have some kids. In the Pathfinder version of this, it also gave you the endurance feat for the duration. Here it's just makes it more likely to actually have conception. I would personally add at least giving advantage on constitution rolls or related stuff. Just give players a reason to have it cast on them, and then forget about it. And then in the post-adventure partying, well, whoops. So there's definitely a bunch. Ooh, Snake Man. Bunch of spells here that are very much in line with that sorted sorcery ethos. Druid spell list, Warlock spell list. As you can see, there's very little in there that would fall under the more superhero style that is often characterized the 5th edition. And then we have the different cults of Xoth. Here we have, like for an example here, the initiation rite for the Altawir, the Ancient One, the Sleeper beneath the Sands, is to gouge out your own eyes as a sign of respect. Whose true form to Altawir, whose true form is forbidden to behold. Chances are this is not going to be one that the players are going to want to pick out, but for NPCs it's good. Gives you their cult spells, skills that the cultists are proficient in. This chapter is very much of use for cultist players. These secrets are not only to members of the cult and the GM, yeah, of course, because this is definitely an NPC one. However, Belit Lil, the moon goddess of Susra, who is, you can guess what she's into. At level 6, you suffer only 1/4 damage when using blood healing. And you can cast Hero's Feast once per week without any material component cost at level 14. And level 18, you suffer no ill effects from the first 3 levels of Exhaustion. So, yeah. Considering that the initiation rite for this cult is to offer your virginity to a member of the or patron of the cult, yeah, you can see what they're into and why they want to not be exhausted. So you have various cults, as well as shorter descriptions of lesser ones. And then we have a short gazetteer of all the different lands and peoples and cities. All of which. Just a short little thing. Not much, but it does give you an idea of the kinds of places that you're dealing with here. Whether it be, mountain fastness of Lamu, to warring city-states of Susra, the Alkazi Desert, the Golden Empire of Kazakhstan, and of course, the jungle kingdoms of the south. All sorts of great stuff. And then you have a little bit of background in the setting with the legends of the place. The former, ancient world is all said to have been dominated by monstrous primal beings with godlike powers. shit went down with them. They're gone now. At least everyone thinks they're gone. They left an ancient empire of their reptilian servants who took over. Those also fell off. Then you have another great empire, more human-like, the Elder Xoth, that also eventually collapsed in and of itself. And now, finally, you have the humans who've now taken over. And you have all these various nasty, nasty NPCs that can be used for villains in your stuff. So, serpent people, weird, Morcockian, Melnibonean, freaky Atlantean types. These descendants of the Elder Xoth, and of course these, subterranean degenerate lizard people. Always fun. And finally, Miscellaneous Xoth, random sword and sorcery tables for ideas that can be rolled on. Do give yourself some ideas of what adventures to create. So this is basically, as I said, Player's Guide to the World of Xoth. It is a good introduction, I would say, to this setting, and a good introduction once you get to the actual adventures, which we'll be getting to pretty soon. I plan on reviewing the entire lot of them, starting with the Spider God's Bride and other tales. That's a good anthology, actually. For what you pay for it, you get 10 whole adventures that can be played in order and gradually increasing difficulty, so it's a good place to get started on this. Frankly, this is a setting I like quite a bit. It follows very much into the general tropes of sword and sorcery, but it has its own flair to it and feel to it. It's very much that Mesopotamia. It's less, how should I put this? It's very much non-European fantasy in that regard. It's very much focused on ziggurats, pyramids, ancient temples, jungles, rather than, castles and knights and stuff like that. It very much feels like a very late Bronze Age, going into early Iron Age kind of setting to it, which, frankly, we need to see more of, because a lot of settings pretty much take either medieval, Tolkien, that kind of stuff, and just go from that, or just go for a almost modern setting and just stick elves in it. And that's pretty much it. I like this setting quite a bit, and the best part is, this book is free. The entire Player's Guide to the World of Xoth, both in its original Pathfinder and 5th edition versions, are available on Morten's website. We'll put the link in the description below. It is well worth checking out. Even if you have no intention of running it for 5th edition or Pathfinder, just looking at the ideas that are contained in there and the general gist of the setting is very much inspirational, I find, for running your own sword and sorcery adventures. And, of course, having it as an introduction to the wider World of Xoth and the adventures that are already written for it, that's already worth the price of admission already, which is, again, nothing. So go download this. There's literally nothing to lose except maybe a little bit of 5 minutes of download time. So I will be back next time with Spider God's Bride and other tales. I'm looking forward to checking that one out for the channel, because that is got some very good sword and sorcery adventuring to it. Until then, I will see you next time. Bye-bye.